The macabre history of the Ashworth family, the body merchants of eastern Kentucky. The earth had not yet settled. In the early hours before dawn, somewhere beyond the scattered timber cabins of the Appalachian frontier, a grave lay open beneath a shroud of mist. The soil was still soft from the previous evening's burial. The wooden coffin, hastily nailed and lowered by grieving hands, now stood exposed to the cold Kentucky air. Footsteps approached. Not the careful tread of a grieving widow. Not the solemn shuffle of a preacher returning to pray. These steps were deliberate, measured, familiar with the work of disturbing the dead. By sunrise, the coffin would be empty, and no one in the settlement would speak of it. Because in 1778, the shadowed hills of what was then Western Virginia land, that would later become Kentucky, the dead, did not always rest in peace. Some were taken, sold, dissected, studied, and some families grew wealthy from the silence. This is the story of the Ashworth family, and the trade they built upon stolen bodies. The American frontier in the late 18th century was not the romantic wilderness of later legend. It was a place of hardship and raw survival. The territory west of the Appalachian Mountains was still contested land claimed by the British Crown, settled by restless colonists and fiercely defended by native nations who had lived there for generations. In 1763, the British government had issued the Royal Proclamation Line, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachians. Few listened. By the 1770s, settlers were pushing deeper into Kentucky territory, carving homesteads out of forests thick with oak and chestnut. The law, however, did not travel well into these hills. Local authority rested in scattered magistrates, circuit riders, and church elders. Justice was uneven. Records were incomplete. In many places, survival mattered more than morality. It was in this fragile world that the Ashworth family rose to prominence. They were not the largest landowners in the region, nor the most devout, but they were respected publicly. Thomas Ashworth, patriarch of the family, arrived in the Kentucky Territory in 1774, 2 years before the colonies declared independence from Britain. Records suggest he came from eastern Virginia, likely of modest gentry stock. He carried letters of reference from a Presbyterian minister and claimed experience as a tradesman, specifically a cooper and part-time surgeon's assistant during the French and Indian War. That detail would later take on a darker meaning. The Ashworth homestead stood near the banks of the Licking River, not far from present-day eastern Kentucky settlements that would formalize decades later. In 1778, this was a volatile region. The Revolutionary War had spread westward. British forces armed native allies to harass frontier settlements. Fear was constant. Death was common. Smallpox outbreaks swept through settlements with brutal efficiency. Childbirth remained perilous. Accidents in the wilderness falls, animal attacks, exposure claimed lives without warning. Graves multiplied, and it was whispered that some did not remain full for long. The first rumors surfaced after the burial of a young boy in the winter of 1778. Samuel McCreary, age 9. He had succumbed to fever after a brief illness that spread through 3 neighboring cabins. The burial took place quickly, as was common in frontier communities. Frozen ground made digging difficult. The coffin was simple pine, constructed by hand. 3 nights later, Samuel's father claimed he heard movement near the family burial plot. He found nothing in the darkness. But in the morning, the soil appeared disturbed. When he opened the grave, the coffin lid had been pried open from above, and the body was gone. There were no drag marks, no animal tracks, no signs of wolves, only human boot prints. The settlement was shaken. Grave robbing was not unknown in colonial America, but it was rare on the frontier. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, medical students sometimes resorted to body snatching. Anatomical study was essential for training surgeons. Yet the law severely restricted access to cadavers. Only executed criminals were legally permitted for dissection. The demand far exceeded the supply. But Kentucky was no city. There were no medical colleges nearby, no surgical theaters, no formal institutions that required bodies. So why would someone risk damnation to steal a child from his grave? The magistrate opened a brief inquiry. It led nowhere, and yet the whispers continued. In colonial society, death carried spiritual weight. Most settlers in the Kentucky Territory adhered to Presbyterian or Baptist traditions. The body, though mortal, was to be treated with reverence. Burial rites were sacred acts. To disturb a grave was not merely a crime, it was sacrilege, which made the growing suspicion surrounding the Ashworth family difficult to confront. Thomas Ashworth was known for his medical knowledge. He set broken bones, treated infections with poultices, assisted in difficult births. In a land where trained physicians were scarce, he was invaluable. He charged modestly for his services, but his wealth grew steadily. By 1779, the Ashworth homestead had expanded. Additional outbuildings appeared, one of which locals referred to only as the shed. It stood slightly removed from the main cabin, windowless, reinforced. At night, faint lantern lights sometimes flickered within. Thomas claimed it was for storage. Few asked further questions, because in frontier communities, dependence breeds silence. Our central figure in this story is not Thomas Ashworth, it is his daughter. Eliza Ashworth was 19 in 1778. Unlike many women of the frontier, she could read and write fluently. Surviving fragments of correspondence preserved in regional archives centuries later suggest she kept detailed journals. Observational, intelligent, reflective, she wrote of scripture of the war, loneliness, and increasingly of unease. In one entry dated March 1779, she described waking in the night to a sound as of hammering beneath the wind. She noted her father's prolonged absences from the main cabin after midnight. She described a scent not of earth but of iron lingering near the outbuilding. Iron, the smell of blood. Eliza never directly accused her father in her writings. Her language grew cautious, fearful. And in the summer of 1779, another grave was opened. This time, the body of an elderly woman. Again, no animals, no signs of struggle. The pattern was undeniable. Yet still, no one publicly named the Ashworths, because Thomas Ashworth delivered babies. He stitched wounds from frontier skirmishes. He prayed beside deathbeds. And in a time when British troops and Allied warriors threatened settlements weekly, the community needed him. Frontier justice was pragmatic. Suspicion without proof meant nothing. What no one in the settlement fully understood was that the Revolutionary War had created new markets, some legitimate, some hidden. Military surgeons desperately needed anatomical knowledge. Improvised field hospitals in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania struggled with infection and trauma. Formal medical schools in cities quietly expanded their need for cadavers. Transportation routes along rivers connected remote territories to eastern ports. And Kentucky, though isolated, was not unreachable. Flatboats traveled downstream toward larger settlements. Goods moved quietly. Unmarked crates were not always questioned. The idea that a frontier family might supply bodies to distant medical practitioners would have seemed unimaginable. But unimaginable does not mean impossible. And wealth on the edge of empire could be made in many ways. In the autumn of 1779, a traveling circuit preacher arrived at the settlement near the Licking River, Reverend Caleb Turner. He was known for stern sermons on sin and repentance. Records from Virginia describe him as unyielding in matters of moral decay. Within weeks of his arrival, he publicly condemned what he called a corruption among us. He did not name the Ashworths, but he spoke of disturbed graves, of desecration, silver urn through darkness. Tension rose. But Thomas Ashworth attended services as usual, calm, polite. Eliza's journal entries from this period grow shorter. Father says the preacher stirs unnecessary fear, she wrote. Then, a line written darker than the rest. I fear not the preacher's words, but the truth beneath them. By the winter of 1783, graves had been reported empty. No formal charges were ever filed, but something shifted. Neighbors avoided the Ashworth property after dusk. Children were warned not to wander near the outbuilding. And Eliza began writing of a plan to leave. What she discovered, what she may have witnessed within that shed remains unclear. But in early 1780, her journal entries stop abruptly. There is no record of her marriage. There's no burial record bearing her name in the settlement. She simply disappears from the documents. Thomas Ashworth, however, continued his work, and the graves eventually stopped being opened, at least publicly. History does not always preserve clear villains, or does it neatly record the crimes that communities choose to ignore. On the American frontier, survival often silenced suspicion. Religion offered comfort but also a shield. And the war for independence created both chaos and opportunity. Did the Ashworth family build their fortune on stolen bodies? Were they supplying distant surgeons in defiance of colonial law? Were the graves disturbed by someone else entirely, someone whose name history erased? What happened inside that windowless shed by the river? What became of Eliza Ashworth? These are the questions we begin with. They are only the beginning. Because buried beneath the early history of Kentucky lies a story not of heroic pioneers, but of commerce with the dead. And the price paid by those who dared to question it. We're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If this story unsettled you, if it made you question how much of early America remains unspoken, take a moment to support the channel. Like this video. Subscribe to Liturgy of Darkness. Share it with someone who believes history is always clean and noble. Tell me in the comments. If you lived on that frontier, suspected your neighbor of trading in the dead, would you speak out? Or would you protect your family by staying silent? In part 2, we follow the money trail eastward into revolutionary area medical networks and uncover evidence that suggests the Ashworth operation may have been far more organized than anyone imagined. The graves were only the surface. What lay beneath is far darker. The Licking River did not ask questions. It carried timber, furs, cornmeal, packed in rough linen sacks, barrels of salted pork bound for eastern markets. And sometimes, under canvas and tar, it carried cargo no ledger recorded. In the winter of 1780, the Kentucky frontier was a thin line between survival and erasure. Cabins were hewn from green logs, their chinking made of clay and moss. Chimneys smoked day and night. Livestock wandered close to doorways. Women rendered tallow by hand. Men kept rifles within reach, even while sleeping. The American Revolution had reached its most uncertain phase. British forces still held New York. Virginia's western counties were stretched thin. Native nations, particularly the Shawnee and Cherokee, were drawn into the war, often allied with British interests seeking to push back relentless colonial encroachment. Every settlement felt vulnerable. Every grave mattered, because death was constant and burial was sacred. The church was not merely spiritual authority on the frontier, it was social glue. Presbyterian meeting houses were simple wooden structures. No stained glass, no ornamentation. Just benches, a raised pulpit, and scripture. Baptist gatherings were often held outdoors or in shared spaces. Sign was preached plainly. Desecration was feared deeply. The body, even in death, belonged to God. Dissection was viewed by most frontier congregations as an act bordering on heresy. In older eastern cities, anatomical study had begun to take root quietly, controversially. The first American medical school had been founded in Philadelphia in 1765. Physicians trained their required cadavers to teach anatomy, but legal access was almost non-existent. English common law, inherited by the colonies, allowed only the bodies of executed criminals to be dissected. On the frontier, executions were rare. Medical schools were distant, and yet demand was growing. That was the hidden current beneath the river trade. Thomas Ashworth understood currents. Publicly, he remained indispensable. He delivered infants in cabins lit by candlelight. He set broken limbs from logging accidents. He treated musket wounds from skirmishes tied to the Revolution. Spoke scripture fluently. He tithed. He listened to Reverend Caleb Turner's sermons without visible reaction. Privately, he kept books no one else saw. Eliza Ashworth discovered them by accident. In early January of 1780, snow pressed heavy against the cabin walls. The settlement had retreated into winter isolation. Travel slowed. River transport paused under ice. Thomas spent longer hours inside the outbuilding. Eliza, restless and unable to sleep, entered the main cabin's loft where her father kept personal papers. She had never disobeyed him openly, but unease had grown into something sharper. She found a ledger bound in worn leather. It was not labeled. Inside, the entries were written in a steady, controlled hand. Dates, numbers, initials, no names, no clear descriptions. But she noticed patterns. Entries clustered in the days following burials, amounts larger than what her father typically charged for medical services. And beside several entries, a single recurring mark, a small inverted cross. Not drawn flamboyantly. Just a notation, a signal. Eliza stared at it for a long time. She was not naive. She understood bookkeeping. Frontier households required careful accounting. But these numbers did not align with flour, tools, livestock, or medicine. They aligned with the disturbed graves. And the timing chilled her. Beneath the ledger, she found folded correspondence. The paper was finer than what circulated locally. Imported. The ink darker, the script unfamiliar. The letters were addressed not to Thomas Ashworth, but to TALR territory. The return notation bore only initials. One letter mentioned specimens received in satisfactory condition. Another referenced future deliveries timed with river thaw. There was mention of Philadelphia instruction and continued discretion. Philadelphia. That was not frontier rumor. That was a real medical center. The only city in the colonies with an established medical college before the war. Eliza's breath tightened. The room felt smaller. She folded the letters carefully and replaced them as she found them. But something inside her shifted permanently. The suspicion was no longer spiritual. It was logistical, organized, intentional. Architecture reveals intention. The outbuilding near the Ashworth cabin had always been an object of curiosity. It was sturdier than necessary for simple storage. Its door was reinforced with iron straps. There were no windows. Out. Inside, according to Thomas, were tools and salted goods awaiting shipment. But Eliza had noticed modifications over the years. Drainage trench cut discreetly behind the structure, concealed vent near the roofline, hooks mounted high along one interior wall. These were not features for storing corn. They were functional, designed. In February 1780, after a snowfall muted sound across the property, Elisa approached the outbuilding while her father was away tending to a distant patient. The door was locked. She had no key. But she had observed enough to know where he kept a spare, under a loose stone near the main chimney. Her hands trembled as she opened the door. The scent struck first, metallic, bitter, not decay. Not yet. Inside, lantern hooks hung empty. A long wooden table dominated the center. Surface was scarred, scraped, cleaned repeatedly, but stained in ways we cannot forget. In one corner stood crates smaller than coffins, larger than toolboxes, lined with coarse cloth, packed with what appeared to be salt. And beneath the table, she saw something that confirmed everything. A surgical saw, not crude, not improvised, but finely crafted, its handle engraved with initials that were not her father's. Imported steel. This was not frontier necessity. This was professional equipment. Eliza closed the door slowly. The wind outside carried distant church bells. Sunday service would begin soon. Her father would kneel in prayer. And beneath the snow, graves rested uneasily. Political tension layered the moment further. By 1780, Virginia's western counties, what would later become Kentucky, were petitioning for greater autonomy. Frontier settlers felt neglected by the eastern elite. Taxes were collected. Protection was inconsistent. Men were drafted into militia units. Supplies were scarce. Trade routes were lifelines. Flatboats floated down the Ohio River toward larger markets. Salt, tobacco, hemp, and timber moved eastward. And in wartime, goods moved quietly. The chaos of revolution created opportunity. Oversight weakened. Documentation lapsed. Crates labeled medical supplies were rarely opened, especially if they traveled under the endorsement of respected intermediaries. Thomas Ashworth's influence extended beyond medicine. He had relationships with traders who operated river routes. He offered them treatment at reduced cost, provided letters of introduction. And in return, they transported sealed cargo without question. Because on the frontier, loyalty was currency, and silence was survival. Reverend Caleb Turner grew more direct in his sermons. He spoke of hidden commerce, of men who wore righteousness like a coat while profiting from decay. He cited scripture on the sanctity of the body. He warned that divine judgment might fall not through war but through exposure. Attendance at services increased. Fear feeds congregations. Thomas remained composed, but he began limiting Eliza's movements. He questioned her about her time in the loft. He asked whether she had spoken to anyone about private household matters. His tone shifted, still calm, but colder. Eliza felt the weight of his authority. In colonial households, the patriarch ruled. Daughters were expected to obey. Inheritance passed through male lines. Reputation was everything. If she accused him without proof, she would not be believed. If she remained silent, she became complicit. Her internal struggle deepened. She loved her father. She respected his skill. She had seen him save lives. She had also seen the ledger, the letters, the saw. And she had stood inside that outbuilding. The church taught obedience. The frontier demanded unity. The revolution called for sacrifice. But what was the cost of truth? In March 1780, the river ice broke. Flatboats resumed movement. Eliza watched from the tree line as two men she recognized, local traders, helped Thomas load crates into a covered wagon bound for the riverbank. The crates were smaller this time, heavier judging by the strain in their posture. They were marked with chalk symbols, not words. Symbols. The same inverted cross she had seen in the ledger. That night, she made a decision. She would follow the trail east, not physically, but through paper, through proof. If Philadelphia was receiving shipments, there would be acknowledgement, records, somewhere beyond the frontier. She returned to the loft and removed one letter, just one. She concealed it within her Bible, a dangerous act. If discovered, she would face consequences not just as a daughter, but as a traitor to her household. She needed corroboration. Days later, she confided cautiously in Reverend Turner. Not fully, not yet. She asked him whether he had ever traveled to Philadelphia. He had, before the war. She asked whether medical colleges required cadavers. He hesitated, then answered carefully. Yes, her voice nearly broke. And if bodies were supplied unlawfully, his expression hardened. That would be both crime and sin. She did not reveal the letter. But she saw in his eyes that he already suspected. The discovery that changed everything came not from Eliza, but from the river. In late April 1780, flatboat traveling downstream struck debris and overturned near a bend in the Ohio River. Local settlers rushed to assist. Crates broke open in the current. Salt spilled into water, and something else emerged. Not grain, not timber, but the unmistakable shape of a human arm, preserved, bound in coarse cloth. Word spread rapidly. The cargo was traced to a shipment originating from the Licking River settlement, from Thomas Ashworth's trade network. The frontier could ignore disturbed graves. It could tolerate suspicion, but it could not deny what floated to the surface. When the arm washed ashore, secrecy ended. And for the first time, the settlement would be forced to confront what it had chosen not to see. The river had delivered its testimony. In Part 3, we examine the fallout, the confrontation between church and commerce, daughter and father, frontier justice, and revolutionary chaos. Because once the dead speak, history cannot remain silent. The arm lay on the riverbank long after the crowd dispersed. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to claim it. The cloth wrapping had come loose in the current. Salt crystals clung to pale skin like frost. The hand was intact, fingernails clean, not the ravaged remains of battlefield carnage. This was deliberate preservation, intentional. Someone had prepared it. The overturned flatboat was hauled to shore by midday, its cargo scattered. Barrels of flour, hemp bundles, its two sealed crates that had split open on impact, and inside them more cloth, more salt, and more parts. The men who discovered it did not shout. No, they did not rage. They went quiet, and quiet spreads faster than panic. By nightfall, word had reached the Licking River settlement. Thomas Ashworth did not attend supper. Eliza noticed first. He remained in the outbuilding long after dusk, lantern light flickering behind the vent, not frantic, not loud, just moving with deliberate calm, as if adjusting to a development he had anticipated. Eliza stood at her bedroom window and watched the faint glow against the dark. The river had exposed something. Her father did not look surprised. That frightened her more than anything. The following morning, 3 riders approached the Ashworth property. They did not wear uniforms, but they carried authority and posture. One was the magistrate from a neighboring settlement. Another was a militia captain, recently returned from skirmishes near the Ohio border. The third was Reverend Caleb Turner. They dismounted slowly. No accusations shouted across the yard, no drawn weapons. Just a measured walk to the cabin door. Eliza watched from inside. Thomas opened the door before they knocked. He had expected them. They spoke privately, voices low, measured. The magistrate's face remained unreadable. The militia captain's jaw tightened occasionally. Reverend Turner's expression carried something heavier, disappointment. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When the men left, Thomas stood in the doorway long after they rode away, still composed, still upright. Something in his eyes had sharpened. He turned and saw Eliza watching. Neither spoke. But something had shifted permanently. By afternoon, the settlement moved differently. Conversations stopped when Ashworth family members passed. Children were called indoors early. Surveillance had begun. Not formal, not organized, present. 2 young men from the militia positioned themselves near the tree line that evening, watching the outbuilding, watching the wagon path, watching for movement. They believed themselves hidden. Thomas did not acknowledge them. But he extinguished the lantern earlier than usual. Darkness settled thick. In that darkness, Eliza heard something she had not heard before. Hammering, not in the shed, but beneath the cabin floor. Dull rhythmic sound. Slow, deliberate. She froze. The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped. When she stepped into the main room, her father was seated at the table, reading scripture. As if nothing had disturbed the quiet, but she could feel it now. There was more than the shed, more than the river shipments. Something else had been prepared. The magistrate called for an inquiry, not a trial. Not yet. Inquiry allowed discretion. Reputation still mattered. Evidence needed to be gathered quietly. Witnesses interviewed. But the river had already delivered proof. The preserved arm was undeniable. The question was origin and intent. Thomas Ashworth volunteered cooperation. He offered his ledger, but not the hidden one. He produced household accounts, medical records, lists of patients, spoke of anatomical curiosity, of war necessity, of advancing surgical knowledge to save colonial lives. He framed the practice not as desecration, but as patriotism. The militia captain listened closely. War justified many things, but grave robbing, even revolution had boundaries. Reverend Turner said little, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas throughout, as if measuring something beyond words. That night, Eliza discovered a folded scrap of paper tucked inside her Bible. Not the letter she had hidden. Another. Small, unmarked. Inside were 3 words. They are watching you. No signature, no explanation. Her breath shortened. Who would leave it there? Her father. Unlikely. He would confront her directly. Reverend Turner? Possibly a warning, or a threat. She scanned the room. The cabin felt smaller, every shadow deeper. If she was being watched by whom, and why? The next morning, one of the militia watchers fell ill. Suddenly, violently, he complained of dizziness, blurred vision, a burning sensation in his throat. By midday, he could not stand. Thomas was summoned to treat him. Of course he was. Irony was bitter. The man who watched him now depended on him. Thomas examined the patient calmly, administered a tincture, advised rest. The illness was attributed to spoiled provisions. Frontier food stores were unreliable. No one questioned further, but Eliza did. She had seen similar symptoms before, not from food, from something else, something administered carefully, in measured doses. She watched her father's hands as he cleaned his instruments, precise, unshaken. Had the illness been coincidence? Or a message? Surveillance carried risk. Thomas Ashworth did not tolerate risk easily. Reverend Turner requested a private meeting with Eliza. They met near the edge of the property, within sight of the church, but out of earshot of the cabin. He spoke carefully. He had seen the crates recovered from the river. He had examined the preservation methods. He confirmed what she already suspected. The workmanship was skilled, professional, not the act of desperate amateurs. He asked her directly, "Do you know more than you have said?" Her silence answered him. He did not press further. Instead, he warned her. If formal charges were brought, the community would fracture. The militia would be divided. War already strained loyalties. Exposure would bring outside scrutiny. Virginia authorities, possibly Continental officers. And once outside authorities entered, control would vanish. The frontier preferred its sins managed quietly, Justice here was negotiated, not imposed. Eliza realized then. The settlement feared scandal as much as crime, and her father understood that perfectly. That evening, another rider arrived, alone. From the east, he carried no militia insignia, but his clothes were finer than frontier wear. He spoke privately with Thomas inside the outbuilding. Eliza strained to hear through the wall. Only fragments reached her. Philadelphia, risk increased. Ledger compromised. Last shipment lost. The rider departed before dawn. He did not stay in the settlement. He did not attend church. He rode hard eastward. Eliza understood something chilling. This was not a local operation. It was networked, organized beyond Kentucky. If her father fell, others would be implicated. Men of influence, men in cities, men protected by distance and status. The power behind Thomas Ashworth extended far beyond the Licking River. The next Sunday, Reverend Turner's sermon shifted. He spoke not of general sin, but of exposure, of hidden deeds brought to light by providence. He cited Numbers 32 to 23. Be sure your sin will find you out. The congregation sat rigid. Thomas attended, head bowed, expression neutral. But when the preacher spoke of those who traffic in flesh, a subtle murmur rippled through the room. The word traffic hung heavy. After the service, several men approached the magistrate openly. Whispers became questions. Questions edged toward accusation. Tension rose like humidity before a storm. And Thomas Ashworth stood at the center of it. Calm. Still calm. It's calm. That night, Eliza heard the hammering again. Beneath the cabin, longer this time. She waited until the sound ceased. Then, barefoot and silent, she lifted a loose floorboard near the hearth. Faint draft rose from below. Cool. Damp. She lowered a lantern cautiously and saw space. Not earth. A hollowed cavity beneath the cabin, large enough to store crates. Or bodies. Her stomach tightened. The shed had been a distraction, the river a distribution route. But beneath their own home, something had been concealed. She replaced the board quickly, her hands shaking. The hidden chamber changed everything. This was not merely opportunistic trade. This was infrastructure. Deliberate. Planned long before suspicions surfaced. Her father had prepared for scrutiny, prepared for concealment, prepared for betrayal. The next morning, she confronted him, not openly, not accusingly, but with a question. Father, have we always had space beneath the cabin? He looked at her for a long moment, long enough to measure her knowledge. Then he smiled faintly. Frontier homes require reinforcement, nothing more, nothing less. But in that pause, she knew he understood what she had found, and he understood that she knew. The silence between them became charged, fragile, dangerous. By evening, the magistrate announced a formal inspection of the Ashworth property, not a search. An inspection. Language mattered. Reputation still held weight. But men would enter the shed. They would examine the grounds. They would look beneath floorboards if necessary. The announcement spread quickly. Crowds gathered at a distance, not openly hostile, but watching. Always watching. Eliza stood near the doorway as the sun lowered behind the trees. Her father moved calmly through the cabin, organizing papers, sealing boxes, adjusting the hearth rug, preparing. The hidden chamber beneath their feet remained undiscovered. For now, the inspection would begin at dawn. Lantern light flickered once more in the outbuilding, then went dark. Eliza did its breath. Eliza did not sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind press against the walls, to distant murmurs, to the faint creak of wood above hollow space. At first light, boots would cross the threshold. Boards would lift. Secrets would surface. And whatever lay beneath that cabin would no longer remain buried. Dawn was coming. And with it, an imminent confrontation that would decide not just her father's fate, but the moral future of the entire settlement. Dawn did not rush. It arrived slowly, a gray light pressing against frost-covered earth. Bootsteps gathered outside the Ashworth cabin, but before the first board was lifted, before the magistrate crossed the threshold, time seemed to pause, like the held breath before a verdict. This was the moment between accusation and consequence, between father and daughter, between survival and exposure. And in that stillness, the true shape of each soul began to emerge. Eliza Ashworth was not born for scandal. She was born into scripture and discipline. Her earliest memories were of ink-stained fingers and candlelit evenings while her father read aloud from the Psalms. She had been educated beyond the expectations of frontier daughters: reading, writing, accounting, even Latin phrases borrowed from medical texts. Her strength was observation. She saw what others overlooked: patterns in ledgers, symbols in margins. The difference between coincidence and design. But her weakness was loyalty. She loved the man now standing across from her. She had watched him cradle dying children, had seen him kneel beside mothers in childbirth, had witnessed genuine compassion in his hands. That compassion now collided with evidence of calculated desecration. Her moral conflict was not abstract, it was personal. If she exposed him, she would destroy her family. If she remained silent, she would betray the dead, and perhaps her own soul. That was her battlefield, not muskets, not militias, but conscience. Thomas Ashworth stood near the hearth, composed, measured, a man shaped by war and frontier necessity. His early years during the French and Indian War had hardened him. He had witnessed amputations performed without anesthetic, soldiers dying not from wounds, but from ignorance. He believed knowledge saved lives, and knowledge required bodies. To him, the dead were not sacred vessels. They were instruments, tools for advancement. He did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as pragmatic. Ahead of his time, he believed the frontier suffered because medicine lagged behind Europe. He supplied cadavers to Philadelphia surgeons. If anatomical instruction improved, if battlefield survival increased, then his actions served a greater good. That was his justification. In his mind, he was not desecrating graves. He was advancing civilization. He believed the living outweighed the dead. He believed the church clung to superstition. His flaw was arrogance. He assumed moral authority over the community. He decided whose bodies could serve purpose. He calculated risk and managed silence. He did not anticipate his daughter becoming his greatest uncertainty. Reverend Caleb Turner stood among the men gathering outside, a preacher shaped by doctrine, raised in Eastern Virginia, educated in Presbyterian theology. He believed firmly in divine order, but he was not naive. He understood the necessity of surgical knowledge. He understood wartime sacrifice. His conflict was institutional. Expose Ashworth fully, and the settlement fractures. Suppress the truth, and his moral authority collapses. He feared scandal more than scandal feared him, because scandal invited outside control. Virginia authorities. Continental oversight. Loss of frontier autonomy. His loyalty was to spiritual integrity. His fear was external interference. He walked a narrow line between righteousness and pragmatism. The magistrate represented law, but law on the frontier was fragile. He possessed limited power. No standing jail, no formal courthouse. Punishment required community consent. He feared chaos. An open trial could divide neighbors, divide militia ranks, undermine unity during wartime. He did not care deeply about anatomical ethics. He cared about order. If Thomas could be contained quietly, perhaps exiled, perhaps fined, the matter might dissolve without spectacle. He sought balance. But balance is difficult when bodies float to the surface. The militia captain embodied another tension. He had seen men bleed out from preventable mistakes, had watched surgeons operate blindly. He knew better training meant fewer graves. If Ashworth's shipments improved battlefield survival, was that not worth discomfort? But he also understood morale. Soldiers fight poorly when they distrust their own community. If their families feared grave desecration, unity eroded. His loyalty was divided between military advancement and civilian trust. He waited for evidence, but he feared what evidence would demand. The intervals stretched. No one entered the cabin yet. The crowd gathered. Whispers layered over frost. Eliza stepped outside, not as a daughter hiding behind a door, but as a witness. Her presence altered the atmosphere. She was known, respected, not rumored, not scandalous. Her voice carried weight. Thomas watched her carefully, not angry, not pleading, simply assessing. The power between them had shifted. He understood now that she had seen too much, and she understood that he would not confess freely. Reverend Turner spoke first, measured tone. Thomas Ashworth, there are questions regarding shipments traced to your property. Thomas nodded. There are always questions in times of change, not defensive, not apologetic, strategic. The magistrate stepped forward. We intend to inspect your outbuilding and surrounding grounds. Thomas inclined his head. We'll find nothing unlawful. That word unlawful. He chose it carefully, because morality and legality were not the same. The tension tightened. But before anyone moved, Eliza spoke, her voice steady. There's more than the shed. Silence fell, thicker than winter air. Thomas's eyes shifted slightly. Not shock, recognition. She had crossed the line. Reverend Turner looked at her. More. She met his gaze. There is space beneath the cabin. The words hung suspended. This was the dramatic pause. The interval. The moment where allegiance fractures, where blood ties weaken, where truth forces daylight. Thomas exhaled slowly. Not in anger, in disappointment. He misunderstands structural reinforcement. Eliza did not look at him. I have seen the chamber. A murmur rippled through the gathering. The magistrate's posture stiffened. The militia captain's jaw tightened. Power shifted visibly, not through force, through revelation. Thomas Ashworth was no longer merely suspected. He was cornered by his own household. But even cornered men calculate. Thomas still possessed influence. He stepped forward calmly. You believe you understand what you saw. His tone softened, addressed not to the crowd, but to Eliza. I have protected this settlement. I have saved lives. I have secured advancement they cannot yet comprehend. He gestured subtly toward the militia captain. You have seen ignorance kill. The captain said nothing, because he had. Thomas continued. The world changes. Knowledge expands. We can cling to burial customs, or we can prevent future burials. Moral ambiguity flooded the space. He was not entirely wrong. Dissection did advance medicine. Ignorance did cost lives. The crowd wavered. Eliza felt it. Her certainty trembled. Was she condemning progress? Was she preserving superstition? Or was she exposing exploitation disguised as progress? That was the weight pressing against her ribs. Thomas pressed further. Would you deny wounded soldiers improved care? Would you choose ritual over survival? He was reframing the narrative, from grave robbing to patriotic contribution, from sin to sacrifice. The militia captain's silence became heavy. Reverend Turner felt his own conviction strain, because Thomas's argument carried logic. But logic without consent becomes tyranny. And consent from the dead is impossible. Eliza saw the shift. Saw doubt spreading like ink. She realized something crucial. If she allowed this to become debate, her father would win. He was articulate, respected, strategic. So she spoke again. Quietly did the families consent. That single question cut through rhetoric. Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked at her, long, measured, because there was no answer that preserved both justification and innocence. The silence became indictment. The magistrate stepped forward again. We will inspect the property. This time, no one objected. Not even Thomas. Because he knew resistance would confirm guilt. Perhaps he had prepared for this. Eliza felt both fear and relief. The interval had ended. The pause dissolved. But the emotional weight remained. She had chosen public alignment over private loyalty. She had shifted power irreversibly. Her father looked at her one final time before the inspection began. Not hatred. Not fury. Something more complex. A recognition that she had become his equal in resolve, and perhaps his adversary. As the first man approached the cabin steps, Eliza made her bold decision fully visible. She walked to stand beside Reverend Turner, not beside her father, a physical declaration, a public one. Whatever lay beneath the floorboards, whatever truth emerged, she would not retreat. The board would be lifted, and she would face what rose from below, even if it destroyed everything she had known. The interval was over. Judgment had begun. The first board lifted with a dry crack. Dust rose into the cold morning air. No one spoke. Men knelt near the hearth, prying wood loose carefully, as if afraid the cabin itself might protest. Eliza stood rigid. Thomas did not move. The opening widened. Lantern light lowered slowly into the hollow beneath the floor, and then a voice from below. There are crates. The word traveled through the crowd like a tremor. Crates meant structure, preparation, not accident. 2 men climbed down. Moments stretched long. The silence was worse than shouting. Then came the second voice, lined with salt. A murmur rippled outward. Faces hardened. Reverend Turner closed his eyes briefly. The militia captain stepped forward, jaw set. Open one. The lid resisted at first, then gave. The men below did not describe what they saw. They didn't need to. Their faces told it. Pale, shaken, confirmed. The magistrate ordered the crates brought into daylight. One by one, they emerged from beneath the Ashworth cabin. Not entire bodies, not chaos, but methodical preparation. Wrapped limbs, preserved torsos, Jord catalogued with chalk marks. There was no denying it now. Settlement had not imagined its horror. It had funded it. Because many had paid Thomas, relied on him, defended him. And now his secret lay at their feet. The public tension did not erupt immediately. It thickened, like a storm waiting for pressure to break. Thomas Ashworth stood beside the exposed crates. He did not plead. He did not deny. He looked instead at the crowd he had served for years, and he spoke. You think this is evil? His voice remained steady. You think this is desecration? He gestured toward the militia captain. How many men have you seen die because surgeons could not navigate the body? Silence answered. He turned toward Reverend Turner. How many prayers have you offered over preventable death? The preacher did not respond. Because the question cut deep, Thomas continued. I supplied knowledge. Knowledge saves lives. The magistrate interrupted. He supplied stolen bodies. The word stolen hung heavy. Thomas met his gaze. I reclaimed what would decay uselessly. A murmur of outrage, but also a flicker of doubt. He was not wrong about decay. He was wrong about consent. But in frontier logic, survival sometimes overrode ceremony. That moral ambiguity unsettled everyone. The magistrate called for a formal gathering, not a lynching, not vigilante justice, a council.
Wow.
The entire settlement would convene at the meeting house by dusk. The Ashworth family would remain under watch, not imprisoned, but contained. The militia guarded the cabin. The crates remained visible. Public reminder. Word spread beyond the settlement quickly. Travelers carried news east and south. The Ohio River incident had already stirred curiosity. Now there was confirmation. Grave theft was no rumor. It was documented. Fear moved through neighboring communities. Families checked burial sites. Graves were reinforced with stone. Night watches were organized. The ripple effect widened. Trust fractured. It's not just in one man, but in the system that allowed him to operate. By sunset, the meeting house overflowed. Men stood along walls. Women filled benches. Children were kept home. Lanterns cast long shadows across plain wooden beams. Reverend Turner opened with prayer, his voice heavier than usual. He did not invoke wrath, invoked clarity, because wrath would divide them further. Then the magistrate laid out the facts. Crates recovered from beneath the Ashworth cabin. Shipments traced to river routes. Body parts discovered and overturned cargo. Correspondence linking shipments to Philadelphia. At the mention of Philadelphia, the room shifted. This was no isolated crime. This was connection to Eastern institutions. 2 educated men, 2 established power. Thomas Ashworth had not acted alone. And that realization chilled the room more than the bodies had. The conspiracy extended beyond Kentucky. It implied protection, demand, funding. Thomas stood to address them again, this time without rhetorical flourish. You want a villain? You want to believe I alone devised this? I did not. A hush fell. This was the first fracture in his composure. Medical instruction in Philadelphia requires cadavers. They do not receive enough from lawful executions. They seek supply elsewhere. He let that settle, they asked. The militia captain's expression darkened. You're saying this was sanctioned? Thomas chose his words carefully. Not publicly, but not condemned privately. The implication was clear. Educated surgeons, respected institutions, benefited. Silence in the meeting house became suffocating. If they condemned Thomas fully, they condemned the medical advancement their own wounded relied upon. If they excused him, They accepted grave desecration as progress. The settlement was trapped. Lisa felt the weight of every eye, because she had triggered this moment. She stepped forward slowly, not to accuse further, but to speak as witness. I saw the letters. They referenced instruction. They referenced timing shipments with river thaw. Her voice trembled only slightly. But nowhere did I see consent from the families. That word again, consent. It cut through logic and progress. Reverend Turner seized upon it. Even war does not erase moral boundary. The militia captain spoke then. Would battlefield surgeons operate blind? He looked at Thomas, and would they rob their own kin to learn? The room held its breath. Thomas did not respond immediately, because this was the emotional cost he had underestimated, not exposure, but betrayal of communal trust. The settlement had entrusted him with life. He had taken from their dead, without asking. Outside the meeting house, whispers intensified. Some argued exile, some demanded imprisonment. A few quietly admitted they understood his logic. Progress had a price. But should that price be hidden? The ripple effects grew sharper. Nearby settlements sent riders to inquire. Virginia officials might intervene. If they did, frontier autonomy would shrink. Taxes could rise. Oversight would increase. The Ashworth scandal threatened not just morality, but political independence. Revolution was already straining colonial unity. Now internal corruption risked weakening frontier credibility. If word reached British ears, it could be weaponized. Stakes extended far beyond one family. Emotionally, the Ashworth household had collapsed. Neighbors who once shared meals avoided Eliza's gaze. Children were warned not to approach. Thomas's younger son, barely 12, sat alone on the meeting house steps, confused, ashamed, punished for knowledge he never held. The cost spread through bloodlines, through friendships, through faith. Reverend Turner felt his own authority tremble. If he mishandled this, he would lose the congregation. If he protected Thomas, he would lose moral credibility. If he exposed the Philadelphia connection, he risked retaliation from powerful men beyond the frontier. Because institutions do not like being implicated, the conspiracy's shadow stretched long. Then came the second revelation. The magistrate produced a recovered letter found in one of the river crates, water-damaged but legible. It bore the seal of a known surgical lecturer in Philadelphia. The letter referenced continued shipments and gratitude for discretion during unsettled wartime conditions. The seal was unmistakable. Gasps filled the room. This was proof, not rumor, not speculation. An established medical authority had knowingly accepted stolen bodies. Thomas had not invented demand. He had supplied it. Conspiracy was institutional. The meeting house atmosphere shifted from anger to something heavier. Disillusionment. If educated Eastern men sanctioned this, what other moral compromises hid behind progress? Was the revolution itself free from hypocrisy? They fought for liberty, yet stole from their own graves. The emotional weight became almost unbearable. The magistrate declared the council would deliberate overnight. Thomas Ashworth would remain under guard. No sentence yet, but no freedom either. The meeting adjourned. Lanterns dimmed. The settlement dispersed into darkness. But the darkness felt different now. Less innocent. More watchful. Eliza returned to the cabin under escort. The hidden chamber gaped open. Crates removed, boards exposed. Her father sat at the table. For the first time, he looked tired. Not defeated, but aware the structure he built was collapsing. "You believe you've saved them?" he said quietly. She did not answer, because she did not know. Had she saved the settlement, or shattered it? Outside, militia guards whispered. One voice carried faintly through the window. "They won't let this reach Virginia. Too many names involved." The second voice replied, "Then what happens to Ashworth?" A pause. "He becomes the example." The word struck like a cold blade. Eliza understood. The conspiracy was larger. Philadelphia would not be tried in Kentucky. Institutions would not fall for one frontier scandal. Responsibility would be localized, contained. Thomas Ashworth would bear it alone. Whether fully guilty or partially protected, he would absorb the blame. A scapegoat. The realization twisted something inside her. Justice was no longer clear. It was political, calculated. Before dawn, another rider arrived. Not from a neighboring settlement. From the east. Carrying sealed orders. The militia captain read them privately. His face tightened. He approached the cabin slowly. Eliza stepped outside. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke. "Virginia authorities request immediate transfer of Thomas Ashworth to Eastern custody." Her breath caught. Transfer meant removal. Not local trial, not community judgment. Something controlled. Something distant. Thomas stepped into the doorway. He understood immediately. The Eastern network had moved, not to protect him, but to silence him. Shocking turning point was not his arrest. It was the realization that the frontier had never truly been in control. The conspiracy reached higher than anyone dared imagine, and now they were taking him away, not for justice, but for containment. They came for him before sunrise, not with shouting, not with spectacle. Just 4 mounted men from the east, bearing the authority of Virginia's Western Command. Their cloaks were dark with travel frost, their orders sealed, their faces unreadable. The settlement gathered anyway. Word always moves faster than horses. Thomas Ashworth stepped from the cabin without resistance. His hands were not bound, not yet, because he was not being dragged as a common criminal. He was being transferred, handled carefully, managed. That distinction did not go unnoticed. Liza stood a few steps away, close enough to see the lines in his face, far enough to make her choice visible. For the first time since the crates were lifted, father and daughter were alone in silence. The militia captain cleared his throat. "Thomas Ashworth, you are to be escorted east for formal inquiry under Virginia jurisdiction?" Thomas nodded once. He looked past the captain. Toward the settlement, toward the meeting house, toward the graves beyond the tree line. "This land will need surgeons," he said quietly, not a plea. "A statement," Reverend Turner answered. "It will also need conscience." The air held still. Thomas turned to Eliza. No anger, no apology, just recognition. "You have chosen your burden," he said. "And you yours," she replied. He studied her for a long moment. Then he mounted. The riders surrounded him. And just like that, the man who had controlled life and death along the Licking River was reduced to a figure disappearing into winter fog. The confrontation had come, but it was quieter than anyone expected. The settlement did not celebrate. There was no triumph. Only a hollow space where certainty once stood. Over the following days, the Ashworth cabin was dismantled. The hidden chamber exposed completely, crates removed, the earth beneath examined. No additional bodies were found. No written confession. Only infrastructure. Tools. Salt. Evidence of system. The shed was burned, publicly. An act of purification. Flames climbed into the pale Kentucky sky. The community watched, not cheering, not weeping, just witnessing. Fire cleanses, but it does not erase memory. Virginia's inquiry was swift, private. Thomas Ashworth never stood trial in Kentucky. Records from Richmond decades later would reference irregular procurement of anatomical materials. No detailed testimony survived, no transcript of full proceedings, only a brief notation. Transported subject deceased during confinement. Cause unspecified. Illness, some said fever, others whispered poisoning. Officially, it was recorded as natural, convenient, clean, contained. Philadelphia's medical faculty faced no public charges, no formal scandal, no disruption. The Revolutionary War demanded attention elsewhere. Yorktown would fall within a year, independence would be secured, and the Ashworth case would fade from official memory, but not from frontier memory. Eliza Ashworth did not leave Kentucky. Many expected she would. That shame would drive her east or south. Instead, she remained. She sold portions of the family property, distributed compensation quietly to families whose graves had been disturbed. No public ceremony, no proclamation, just private restitution. It did not undo what was done, but it acknowledged it. She worked alongside Reverend Turner to strengthen burial practices, stone reinforcement, deeper graves, community oversight. A rotation of night watchers during vulnerable seasons. The settlement grew more cautious, more unified, and more suspicious of distant authority. Because what they had learned was not simply that one man had stolen bodies. They had learned that institutions benefited from silence, that progress often wore clean gloves, that power preferred local scapegoats. The ripple effect did not stop at their borders. Word of the Ashworth scandal traveled slowly through frontier networks. Other settlements began inspecting burial grounds. Medical shipments were scrutinized. River cargo was examined more closely. In time, anatomical laws in eastern states would begin to evolve. Not out of moral awakening alone, but because uncontrolled body snatching threatened public trust. In 1788, New York would pass one of the first laws regulating cadaver procurement after violent protests against grave robbing. The frontier had seen the danger earlier, but history would not credit them. Reverend Turner's sermons changed. Less fire, more warning. He spoke often of accountability, not just for individuals, but for systems. He reminded his congregation that corruption rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with justification, it's logic. With arguments that sound reasonable in isolation, he did not demonize Thomas in memory. He did something more unsettling, described him as human, a man who believed he was advancing knowledge, a man who convinced himself the dead could not object, a man who underestimated the cost of secrecy. That nuance preserved the lesson, because monsters are easy to dismiss. Neighbors are not. Years passed. Kentucky would eventually become a state in 1792. The frontier would formalize. Courthouses would replace meeting-house councils. Medical institutions would expand. Anatomy would become essential to modern surgery. Legal frameworks for cadaver donation would slowly emerge. But the ethical debates never fully disappeared. Faith and science would continue to collide. Power would continue to rationalize itself. And communities would continue to ask, who pays the hidden cost of progress? Eliza aged quietly. She never married. Her journals, carefully kept, would later surface in fragmented form among regional archives. She wrote not of vengeance, not of triumph, but of weight, the weight of knowing, the weight of choosing. In one entry from 1795, she reflected, "Truth does not cleanse, it exposes. And once exposed, nothing returns to its former innocence." She visited her father's unmarked burial site once, a modest plot outside the settlement. No stone, no epitaph. She did not kneel. She stood. For a long time, then left. Some say she carried guilt for years. Others say she carried clarity. Both may be true. The unresolved mystery remained. In the dismantling of the cabin and shed, ledgers were recovered, but not the complete record. Several pages were missing. Correspondence referenced additional shipments never traced. Names reduced to initials. Financial figures larger than what Thomas alone could accumulate. There were hints of a secondary route, second supplier, perhaps another settlement involved, perhaps another physician along the river. The Philadelphia lecturer named in the damaged letter continued his career without interruption. Students trained under him went on to serve in hospitals across the new nation. Did they know where their cadavers came from? Did they ask? Or did they accept the silence because the results justified it? No surviving document answers that question, and that is the final unease. Thomas Ashworth may have been exposed. But was he the origin, or merely a link? Was the conspiracy limited to river crates, or woven deeper into early American medicine than frontier memory captured? The foundations of the Ashworth cabin were eventually reclaimed by earth. Grass grew. Children played nearby. Time smoothed the scar. But beneath that soil, once lay a chamber built not just to store bodies, but to store compromise. History often celebrates progress in clean lines. Innovation, revolution, independence. But beneath many foundations lie choices made in shadow. Compromise is justified by necessity. Silence is maintained for stability. The Ashworth story is not solely about grave robbery. It is about how communities respond when progress collides with morality. It is about faith confronted by ambition. It's about power shifting responsibility downward when exposure threatens upward structures. And it is about one young woman who chose revelation over loyalty, not because she hated her father, but because she feared what silence would make her become. The American frontier survived. The nation was born. Medicine advanced. But somewhere in that advancement lingers the echo of crates lifted into daylight, sermons spoken with trembling restraint, of a daughter standing beside truth while her father rode into fog. The fire that burned the shed did not burn the question. It only illuminated it briefly. power protects itself. Faith wrestles with doubt. Corruption often hides behind noble language, and accountability rarely travels upward without resistance. So as the river continues to flow through Kentucky, as graves settle quietly under stone, as institutions teach anatomy in bright lecture halls, remember this story? Remember the chamber beneath the floorboards? Remember the choice made in winter light? Because history is not only what is written, it is also what is concealed. And sometimes the most dangerous things are not buried in coffins, but beneath foundations. What do you believe was truly buried beneath those foundations?